We are honored to have with us this evening Peter Brooks and Edwin Frank. Peter Brooks is the Sterling Professor of Comparative Literature Emeritus at Yale University, where he was the founding director of Yale's Whitney Humanities Center and chaired the departments of comparative literature and of French. He has also taught at numerous institutions around the world, including the University of Virginia, Princeton, Harvard, and Oxford, where he holds an honorary master's. Among other honors, he is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a corresponding fellow of the British Academy. Professor Brooks's books encompass the novel and the theory of narrative, psychoanalysis in relation to literature, and law and the humanities. His many books include Flaubert in the Ruins of Paris, Henry James Goes to Paris, Psychoanalysis and Storytelling, the widely republished and translated The Melodramatic Imagination, and 2 novels. Edwin Frank is a widely published poet and the founder and editorial director of the NYRB Classic Series, a publisher of old books and new translations. New York Review Books reintroduces out-of-print works, many in first translations from around the world, to the reading public. Since its inception, the series has won dozens of awards. And we're glad of that organization because they have now brought us Peter Brooks's Balzac's Lives. Here to delve into that are Peter Brooks and Edwin Frank.
And thank you, Peter, for being here to talk about your wonderful book, and thank everybody else out there. This is an unusual book, and I think in a way it grew out of initially our collaboration on the selection you made of Balzac's stories and novellas that we published, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago. Probably longer than that, time flies, called The Human Comedy, by which we wanted to suggest that it was a sort of distillation of of Balzac's larger endeavor altogether. And that's what, in a way, you've done yourself now. I mean, it's so that this book is a kind of, almost in a way, a mirror image, a kind of distillation of Balzac's, or what you see Balzac as taking the whole, how to describe this immensely teeming creation full of, what is it, 2,754 separate characters? Is that?
I think 4,472.
Oh, okay, all right. I'm always bad with numbers. But how did you? You came to me originally suggesting you wanted to write a biography of Balzac, but that then this project took a new shape in your mind. And how did that come around? Because the book you've produced is really a different book from your other. You've written all sorts of different books, but this is a new endeavor in a way.
Absolutely, and I've got to thank you, Edwin, for being such a terrific editor, both of that collection of short stories and of this book, which wouldn't have taken the form it did without your great help. Yeah, I've been wanting to write a book for about 30 years on Balzac. In fact, I found an old outline of a book that dates from 1985, a book on Balzac, which I abandoned. I didn't know how to do it. It's just such a vast piece of work, over 90 novels and tales. How do you get a handle on it? A biography would be the most obvious thing, but there are already some good biographies of Balzac, including one very good one in English. And anyway, I've never been that great a fan of literary biography because I think it tends to scant the work for the life. I mean, the what you ate for breakfast always is sort of more important than what you wrote in most biographies. And then the idea came to me of writing biographies of some of the individual characters, because among those 2,472, extraordinary number. I don't think anyone, even Shakespeare, has created quite that many. Those characters really create a vast panorama of France in this moment of extraordinary change and dynamism, following the French Revolution and the Napoleonic epic, which led French armies and French law and civilization to all the corners of Europe. And then that collapsed with the Battle of Waterloo, and the monarchy was restored in 1815 but it really didn't know how to handle things, and eventually it collapsed in another revolution in 1830, and so on. So he's living at this moment of extraordinary rapid change, and he is seeing French society in its totality as a product of change, I think. And he came upon this wonderful technique of characters who return from one novel to another, which means it's a very crowded universe, but one that we can master partly because we've seen, this poet in another novel. So we know something of his background, of what he means. And it enables him really to create the whole of society. He's writing mainly after the Revolution of 1830, which brought the bourgeois monarch to the throne and opened a great period of capitalist expansion and financial wealth. But he's looking back mainly at the 1820s, where most of his novels take place in the Restoration period. So he already has this kind of historical perspective. He loved Walter Scott, and it's a little bit like Walter Scott's historical novel zoomed up to, just a few years difference between the writing time and the time he's writing about.
Mm-hmm. It's a sort of history of the present that is going on here.
It's the historical novel of the present, in a way, yeah.
And one thing you talk about a bit in the book, and in a minute we'll get to the core of the book, which is the examination of the lives of the characters who are so crucial in the human comedy, is that Balzac was an avowed conservative, and basically, but even as an avowed conservative, he was a tremendous critic of the Restoration. So he's both he both is a nostalgist for an older order and a critic of the failure to bring that new order into play in a new world. So it's a peculiar position that he takes.
Absolutely. I mean, he declares himself a little bit flamboyantly a monarchist and Catholic, and the Restoration should have been, the triumph of monarch and Catholic Church. But he sees that the Restoration was kind of a fake monarchy. It tried to turn back the clock and reinvent all the privileges and caste distinctions of the old regime, but it didn't enlist the dynamic young talent of France, including Balzac himself. He makes this contrast to, I don't know how accurate it is, to the English Tories. He said the English Tories went out and recruited intelligent young men, always men, of course, whatever class they belonged to or came from, whereas the Restoration was so full of snobbery and caste distinctions that it never could do that. So it collapsed, and it should have collapsed, according to him. So though he's a monarchist and a Catholic, he's always been appreciated by the Marxists, starting with Marx and Engels themselves, who saw that he understood and analyzed the contradictions of early capitalist France better than anyone.
Well, let's get to the sort of new man par excellence, who is kind of the character who kicks off your book, but also is sort of the man making an entry to society at just this moment of the Restoration, Rastignac. And I think you were going to read us a bit of the book so we could get some of it.
Sure. Rastignac, if you call someone a Rastignac in France still today, everyone knows exactly what you mean. A young man of great ambition who will stop at nothing to get where he wants to go, though he's also a character of enormous charm and seductiveness. He's living in this miserable pension, and next to him is what appears to be a sort of middle-aged businessman, but actually we'll discover is a convict in disguise named Vautrin, and we'll talk more about him. So this is just a short passage on how Vautrin plots Rastignac's success. In Vautrin's analysis, there are only two paths in life, what he calls stupid obedience or else revolt. He vividly unfolds to Eugène the way of obedience, years of legal studies, painful attempts to make ends meet as a lawyer, pleading for the rich and sending anyone with a spark of life to the guillotine. Bare subsistence as a lower magistrate, then at age 40, marriage to a miller's daughter with a small dowry. Only dirty tricks as a public prosecutor might secure some influence, and even so his sisters will remain old maids since he won't be able to dower them. As for his own fierce desires for women, for money, not a chance. Here is the crossroads of life, young man. Choose. But you've already chosen. You called on your cousin de Beauseant, and you caught the scent of luxury. You called on Madame de Restaud, Goriot's daughter, and you caught the scent of a Parisian woman. You came back here that day with a word written on your forehead that I could read. Succeed, succeed at any price. To which Vautrin responds, bravo, that's the kind of fellow I like. To revolt is to take destiny into your own hands by a decisive act. Choose, but you have already chosen. Vautrin's reading of the message written on Eugène's forehead summarizes the appetites that will drive the novel. Rastignac doesn't deny it. As Vautrin unfolds his future financial needs in a society where young men, like spiders in a teapot, are out to eat one another, Eugène responds eagerly, what do I have to do? Vautrin has a plot for him, a revolt plot that turns on another boarder at the Pension Beaucaire, Victorine Taillefer. She's the daughter of a banker who made his fortune by murdering his best friend. And this is the subject of another Balzac tale, The Red Inn, and who, suspecting Victorine to be illegitimate, plans to leave it all to his son, Frédéric. I don't like that sort of unfairness, Vautrin declares. Like Don Quixote, I take the side of the weak against the strong. So his plan, Vautrin will set up a duel in which Frédéric Taillefer will be killed at the hand of a colonel who is Vautrin's friend and a master swordsman. I will take on the role of Providence. I will make up God's mind for him. And Vautrin further elaborates, there are no such things as principles, there are only events. There are no laws, there are only circumstances. Rastignac at first reacts with horror, and Vautrin retorts, but if he doesn't take this path to his success, he's sure to do worse someday, whoring his youth and his beauty for support from a woman. Virtue, my dear student, is not divisible. It either is or it isn't. Vautrin, the spirit of negation, has the eloquence of Lucifer or Mephistopheles. He's the only moral absolutist in the novel and the only character to see the world as it truly is. In sections of Capital in the 21st Century, entitled Vautrin's Lesson in Rastignac's Dilemma, economist Thomas Piketty demonstrates that the terms of Vautrin's choice are financially accurate. Then as now, only an inheritance like Victorine's can satisfy Rastignac's demand for luxury and power. Salary alone won't do it. If Rastignac is to find an out from Vautrin's stark choice of obedience or revolt, he needs that kind of money. The heart's a good guide, Eugène offers by way of a retort to Vautrin. We may react, I think, to his call upon the heart with the knowing smile of Vautrin. The heart can indeed be used to open up a path to fortune, and Vautrin will continue to tempt and teach him, cornering him each time he returns to the pension from his latest foray into society. Vautrin's presence in the novel raises the stakes for the readers for Eugène. He voices the large issues that have to be decided, permits no concealment of what's involved in the search for worldly success. This man, who will be revealed as a criminal mastermind and banker to the shadowy society of convicts, articulates the clearest moral message of the novel. I think I'll stop there.
So I mean, here we have Rastignac, who comes from a provincial French family with a noble, minor nobility,
Right.
No money to speak of, just who's come to Paris, who means to be a law student, and quickly realizes in Paris that respectable life really won't get him what he wants, and sort of stumbles on. He has a mysterious neighbor in the pension, this old man who everybody seems to despise, who he discovers is related to two beautiful women high in society who he's met. And he finds their secret. And somewhere, in a way, the book is a discovery that he can trade in those secrets. And trading those secrets, which are sort of backstairs secrets. He discovers that Goriot, who's living in more and more miserable rooms in this pension,
was once very wealthy, gave all his money to his daughters to marry them off, one to a banker, the other to a real aristocrat, but an aristocrat who needed to replenish the family fortune. And he also discovers that with the banker's wife, Delphine de Nucingen, he can get love and money in the same breath, so to speak, because he falls in love with Delphine, or he chooses Delphine as the most plausible person to fall in love with. She's the banker's wife and not at all getting on well with her husband, but her husband finds her lover, which Rastignac eventually becomes, very useful in his financial speculations as a kind of cover and straw man. So in this ironic twist in the future, his lover's husband makes his fortune, very literally.
And Rastignac's a strange character because he's sort of, I mean, in one sense, he's a kind of ingenue in society, having to be told by Vautrin just how muddy, and there are all these images of his getting mud on his pants because he can't take cabs and so on because he's too poor to do it, and knowing he has to pull himself out of the mud, but the only way to get out of the mud is to sort of dip himself ever deeper in the moral mud, which he regrets, but eventually does.
He's a quick learner and a good compromiser, right? I mean, Vautrin's role in the novel is partly to pose the extremes and say there's no compromise possible. It's either obedience or revolt. But Rastignac finds a median term, which he calls struggle, which is getting ahead, getting your conscience a little dirty, but not actually indulging in a plot to kill anyone. And so by the end of the novel, he's learned a great deal, and he will go on in later novels where we catch glimpses of him actually to become not only wealthy, but a political power in France and a peer of the realm. Oh.
He, in another novel you write about the Peau de Chagrin, or the Wild Ass's Skin, Rastignac figures, and this is the book I think that Balzac sort of first made a success as a novelist with in 1831. One of the things that's so extraordinary about him is that he produces all of these books in the course of 20 years with an unbelievable
labor. Right. Between 1830 and 1850, he writes 90 plus novels. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and the hero of the Wild Ass's Skin is Raphael de Valentin, who also is a young man on the make. And though this book was written before Père Goriot, he meets Rastignac after the events that will be described in Père Goriot.
Right.
And Rastignac, he's sort of a protege of Rastignac's, but Raphael's a very different character because he's a kind of all or nothing character and finds himself in the position to satisfy those desires, sort of.
Right. When we first meet him, he's about to commit suicide because he's absolutely penniless. But then he goes into an antique shop, and the antiques dealer gives him this magic skin, which will realize all his wishes. But as it does so, it will shrink. And I'm interested in the fact that just as he was about to end his life, Freud read this novel. And if I can, I'm just going to read a paragraph about that. At the very end of his long life, just before he asked his personal physician, Max Schur, to fulfill a long-held promise to inject him with a lethal dose of morphine when the pain of his cancer became too unbearable, Sigmund Freud finished what was to be his final reading. Freud did not read at random, Schur tells us, but carefully selected books from his library. His final choice fell on Balzac's La Peau de Chagrin, The Fatal Skin. When he finished the book, the day before he called for the fatal injection, he remarked to Schur, "This was the proper book for me to read. It deals with shrinking and starvation." Not only, of course, with shrinking and starvation, but with all that precedes the final outcome of human desire, with wanting, having, possessing, devouring. The Fatal Skin seems so perfect a final reading for Freud that Schur's anecdote would almost appear contrived if we didn't know it were true. In fact, Balzac's novel captures the essence of Freud's late thought from beyond the pleasure principle onward, given its final expression in one of his last essays called Analysis Terminable and Interminable, where he claims a precursor in the pre-Socratic philosopher Empedocles of Agrigentum. Empedocles saw the world as a struggle of eros and nexos, love and destruction. For Balzac, as for Freud, to choose love and desire is also inevitably to choose destruction and death. The organism seeks to return to its primal quiescence. The emblem of the magic skin figures the overall logic of desire and its fulfillment. Desire sets us afire and power destroys us, as the old antiques dealer tells Raphael early in the novel. Desire turned into power, realized in the world, inevitably leads to death. Any attempt to arrest this logic leads to sadism, for instance. That is, the internal destructive force turned outwards towards other human beings, as in war, or to a life of wisdom that, however admirable it may be judged, seems always to give a result that is sterile and barren. The antiques dealer is 102 years old, but all his enjoyments are in his imagination. To refuse life and desire is to condemn yourself to that analog of Origen's castration described in Raphael, when after learning the power of the skin, he tries to, as he puts it, castrate his imagination, turn the world ugly, as through the special opera glass he has constructed that breaks up all beautiful lines in the world, in particular makes women, who might be objects of desire, something ugly. A world that denies desire is ugly and lifeless. All of Balzac's young protagonists instinctively understand that. It is desire that makes life worth living. But as Raphael is given a special dispensation to understand, the choice to live the gratifying life of desire is at the same time the choice of death. There's no way out of that stark conjecture.
Yeah, and we should say that what happens to Raphael is that, bent on suicide, he stumbles into this antique store and finds this sort of ugly skin, which the dealer sells to him, and it gives him, it's Arabian Nights territory, really. I mean, all of his wishes will come true, and this gives Balzac an opportunity to describe tremendously realistically, as you describe in your book, orgies, all sorts of events of the life of the Restoration, in effect, that Raphael brings on himself. But as is always true in such stories, the other problem with the skin is that every time it grants a wish, it shrinks. Right. So it is, as you say, a zero-sum game. And in that, he also relates it really to sexuality, which is why Freud, I think, is so, as indeed Balzac's world is suffused with money and sexuality and sublimation and which you talk about.
Yeah, Balzac apparently took over from his father a belief that male sexuality was a zero-sum game. There was only so much sexual substance, essentially sperm, that you could spend in life. It's like money, and either you can spend it over a long period of time, conserving yourself like the old antiques dealer who reaches age 102. And there are a few of those very old men in Balzac, particularly the money lender and usurer Gobseck, whose pleasures are all internal, imaginary, or you can spend it wildly in a short, enjoyable, orgiastic life, which is what most of the young heroes do. And once Raphael discovers that choice, he tries to conserve his life by avoiding desiring, right? And that's that special opera glass he has made, and he has a servant who's supposed to never let him use any sentence which involves wishing or wanting, right? Because every time he says wish or want, the skin will shrink. Yeah.
And he's put it on the wall, as I remember, and traced a line around it so that, whenever he accidentally says, well, I hope you feel better or something like that.
Right. And towards the end, he's forced to fight a duel. And after he wishes the death of this person, who of course dies, right? The bullet hits him right in the heart. He pulls out what's left of the skin, and it's shrunk to the size of a little leaf, right? And he knows the end is very close. It's a wonderful parable or parabolic form of all the other novels, really.
Yeah. Well, let's take a third sort of paradigmatic young man, because there's the desire for social success, the desire for sexual satisfaction, and then there is the desire for aesthetic glory and for literary success, which was close to Balzac's own heart. And that he explores in the character Lucien de Rubempré, who in a way is very, is not really a portrait of Balzac. One almost feels like Balzac is closer to Vautrin, or is somehow splitting the difference. But then Balzac uses character to split all these endless differences and nuances in a curious way. But we should say what Lucien's situation is.
Lucien's the young aspiring poet who comes from the provinces, and that's a very common dynamic in Balzac. If you have talent and you want to develop it, you have to leave the provinces and come to Paris. So he comes to Paris with a volume of manuscript poetry under his arm, and also an historical novel. He can't get them published. You have to be unknown talent before you get published. And then he meets another sort of disillusioned writer who initiates him into the world of journalism. And this, of course, will be both the vehicle of his great success. He becomes very well known very quickly as a journalist, but then it undoes him and destroys him through the politics of the journal. And I thought I'd just read a passage which involves a number of journalists discussing what they do, because it's so prescient of what we've been going through in the last 4 years. I mean, think Fox News when they have this conversation. It's at a party after the theater, and there's a German diplomat present, and he recounts an anecdote that in 1814, when the German armies had defeated Napoleon and made their way to Paris, two German generals were standing on the hill of Montmartre, looking down at Paris. One of them said, "We should burn the city." And the other, the Prussian General Blücher, said, "Don't you dare. France will be destroyed only by that," meaning Paris, meaning actually the intelligentsia gathered in Paris, who were going to undercut the very principle of the nation. And the German diplomat goes on to suggest that is indeed now happening through the newspaper. It marks the destruction of authority. Bringing information to the mass of the people will so revolt. The journalist Claude Vignon agrees with him. Newspapers are evil, though an evil the government would be better off making use of to its own ends instead of fighting it. Yes, says Émile Blondet, another journalist, newspapers are poison shops, and Vignon piles on. This is Vignon. The newspaper, instead of being a sacred mission, has become an arm for the political parties. And from that, it became a commercial enterprise. Like all commercial enterprises, it knows neither faith nor law. Every newspaper, as Blondet puts it, is a shop where one sells to the public words in whatever color it likes. All newspapers will in due course be cowardly, hypocritical, shameless, mendacious, murderous. They'll kill ideas, systems, men, and will thrive from doing so. Well launched on this tirade, Vignon goes on to say, "We all know, such as we are, that newspapers will go farther than kings in ingratitude, farther than the dirtiest business dealings and speculations and calculations, that they will devour our brains every morning to sell their intellectual narcotics, but we will all write for them, like workers in a quicksilver mine who know that they will die from their labor." And then Lousteau goes on to describe the new publication he's starting. "The newspaper holds to be true whatever is probable." We start from that. So here we have journalists attacking journalism, and I think their ferocity reflects Balzac's own obsessions, and also a crucial moment in the history of the press, of printing, and of politics in France. To Balzac, newspapers incarnated the very anti-principle of the kind of political and social authority that he wanted to believe in and claimed to think was necessary for the country. France in the 1820s saw an extraordinary burgeoning of newspapers, which were becoming a daily reality and a political force of a type never seen before. It was largely the effort of the Restoration monarchy to muzzle the press that brought it down in the Revolution of July 1830. Journalists and also printers were in the vanguard of that July Revolution. Someone during this party remarks that journalistic excess is sure to lead to a new repression of the newspapers. And the novelist Raoul Martin, who's present, replies in what sounds like a belated response to that Prussian general, "Bah, what can legislation do against French intellect?" Balzac himself was both a journalist and a novelist, two roles that for many of his contemporaries were really indistinguishable. Most of his fiction appeared in part or entirely in the periodical press before publication in book form. He was in fact the first French novelist to publish what was called a roman feuilleton, a serial novel that ran daily on the front page of the newspaper. Extraordinary to look at them. They usually occupied the bottom quarter or third of the newspaper on the front page. In 1836, shortly before undertaking the composition of what would become Lost Illusions, Lucien's novel, his novel, The Old Maid, La Vieille Fille, ran in La Presse, a right-leaning newspaper, and he published as well in the liberal rival, Le Siècle. And in 1835, he bought his own periodical, La Chronique de Paris, which early in the following year made its debut with a stellar group of writers, but soon succumbed to bankruptcy. Earlier yet, Balzac had attempted to master the means and modes of literary production by purchasing and presiding over a print shop and also a type foundry. That enterprise went bankrupt too. Nonetheless, in creating it, Balzac displayed a prescient understanding of the means of production of literature in his time. I'll stop there.
Yeah, it's interesting because Lucien, who begins by wanting to be a poet and has a kind of florid romantic sense of the writer's calling, even as he shows himself able to be a completely to be the journalist par excellence, turn every reverse every opinion if he needs to, and so on. Right. Ends up being in a way a novelist who gets caught in a great novel of exactly the sort he himself could never find his way to write. Balzac is the one who could write the book about the means of production, about the wheels that are grinding down people like Lucien, and also feel a kind of a sorrow for that loss, even as he shows why it was inevitable.
That's right. I mean, it's an extraordinary performance because he is, in a sense, denouncing the very world that he's caught up in and knows he's caught. I mean, he's like Claude Vignon. He's in the Quicksilver mine and can't get out, but he can see it and analyze it. The great Hungarian Marxist critic Georg Lukács described that novel as the tragicomic epic of the capitalization of spirit, and that's just about right. It's about mind turning into a commodity.
Yeah. Well, we should talk, I mean, also in terms of Balzac's reception and success, but also in terms of the characters that whose lives you recount in Balzac's lives, about some of the female characters and his female readers.
Yes.
Who were crucial to his success.
Right. I mean, his success really did come originally from women readers. They were the ones who had the time, the leisure to read novels. But also, he made a special appeal to their inner lives. The nasty, famous contemporary critic, Sainte-Beuve, accused him of conquering his public like a plague by revealing women's secret wounds and desires. And in something like The Story of Two Young Wives, which you published in a new translation, or The Woman of 30, and many other novels, he really does show an extraordinary understanding of the rotten lot of women at the time, right, who were taken from convent school, married off to much older men who have no sense of nurturing them, who are off having their own affairs, in the demi-monde of prostitutes, which was very common at the time, whereas women are supposed to all remain virtuous and raise their children and so on. And Woman of 30, for instance, has a strong contrast between the women who remain virtuous, one who runs off with a pirate and has a great time. I mean, she ends badly, but for a while she's really fulfilled in every way. Or in the two young wives, one who makes a marriage of reason, takes care of the family fortunes, practices birth control so there won't be too many children to take care of, whereas her former friend from the convent school marries for love with unfortunate results. So yeah, he's not a feminist, but there's something almost androgynous about Balzac, that he can get into the skin of lots of different people, including people of the other gender. And gosh, we don't have enough time, but there's an extraordinary story which is published in the collection that you did of short stories about a soldier who gets lost in the desert during Napoleon's Egyptian campaign and finds he's sharing an oasis with a panther and falls in love with the panther. It's a way for Balzac to discourse of women as something very alluring, but also dangerous. It's a story I recommend highly.
Yeah, and also I think a story which his sense of sexuality and the way it flows not only between the sexes, but a kind of animality within
Right.
of something within each of us that is apart from us in a curious way, which he's keenly aware of. I mean, the stories of sexual deadlock and fascination, like the Duchesse de Langeais, the way the excess desire spills into political, is reflected in the political world. He neglects. Henry James adored Balzac, and in a way, all of Henry James's novels have a Balzacian plot of underneath them, a simple plot of somebody trying to take advantage of somebody, even as James extrapolates all sorts of financial, but also psychological, and the very confusion there is typical of Balzac in a way, and complications. But he really learned. I mean, he wrote a late piece called "The Lesson of Balzac," and that is a lesson he continued to learn, I think, throughout his career.
Absolutely. I mean, I think he wrote 5 separate essays on Balzac, including the Lesson of Balzac. He claims that if you want to be a novelist, you've got to study Balzac to learn your trade. And he says at one point that the great thing about Balzac is that he gives his creative characters the long rope to develop who they are. And even his villains develop their full sort of potential as characters. And that he loves. And he thinks that there are very few other novelists who respect what he calls the liberty of the subject quite as much. And that's interesting because it translates in James into a kind of ethical imperative of not to meddle with other lives too much, right? Not to exercise the kind of manipulative control that a Gilbert Osmond does on Isabel Archer, to take an example.
Well, I'll say, I mean, a central concern of your book, and then we'll turn to questions, is vicarious living, manipulation of other people, as Vautrin tries to do with Rastignac, as he successfully does with Lucien, but as the novelist also seeks to do. And so the centrality of this living through others and the difficulties or moral and or practical of living through others is also a fundamental concern in this book, your book.
Yeah, absolutely. And in that sense, Vautrin is a kind of figure of the novelist, right? Someone who is short and ugly and marked as a convict himself, but finds these beautiful young men whom he can father. And I mean, there's clearly a very homoerotic element to it, but it's not overt. It's not that he wants to have sex with them, that he wants to live through them. And he says to Lucien when he rescues him from his intended suicide, I'm going to live through you. I'm going to live in your loves. I'm going to ride in a carriage along with you. And so it's this projection of self into others. And there's a short story I talk about, Facino Cane, which gives a picture of a young novelist learning his trade who does just that. He follows people in the street, and then he suddenly projects himself into their bodies and souls. And again, the comparison is to the Arabian Nights, which was always Balzac's idea of the highest literature. You can exercise sort of this magical talent of getting yourself into another person's skin, but it's also dangerous. It may lead to madness. He was always fearful that maybe he had created too much, that he was sort of transgressing on the territory of God the Father.
All right. Well, so why don't we take some questions, or that?
Yeah.
I think Sarah will,
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Mhm.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That was fantastic. So we do have some questions already in the chat, and I encourage our audience members to add your questions and comments as we go along. So I'm going to jump off with this one because you just mentioned the Arabian Nights, the 1001 Nights. Someone asked about the influence on Balzac's writings. Is there anything else you might want to add to that? How did he? What version of it was he even reading or coming across?
He was probably using the famous 18th century translation by Galland, which was very popular in France. I think moments where there are allusions or mentions of the Arabian Nights are almost always in Balzac a moment where the material world sort of opens up its curtains part, and you discover something that lies behind, something that is a little bit magical, or maybe simply a kind of explanatory force of what drives the world. You know, he had his studies of manners, which are most of his novels, but then he had some other novels that he calls philosophical studies, which were supposed to talk about the principles that drive social life. And Fatal Skin, La Peau de Chagrin, that we were talking about, is one of those philosophical tales. It takes you behind the world of behavior to those big forces that are driving behavior. And that, for him, is comparable to the Arabian Nights.
Fascinating. A couple of people have asked about comparisons, similarities, and differences between Balzac and two separate other authors. One person asks about Dickens, and one person asks about Proust. Would you like to speak about either or both of those?
Briefly on Dickens, and maybe a little bit more on Proust. I mean, Dickens does seem comparable, but Dickens' characters don't have the kind of demonic side of Balzac's. And also, as Balzac said in criticism of Walter Scott, whom he loved, he said, unfortunately, Walter Scott had to deal with English Puritan women, and so he didn't have the pleasure of describing sinning and redeemed Catholic women, who are so much more fun. There's a lot more sex in Balzac, for one thing. Proust, I mean, Balzac was enormously important to Proust. He wrote about Balzac a great deal, and he was particularly impressed by Balzac's opening up of worlds of closeted sexuality to novelistic representation. He was particularly loved the scene in the end of Lost Illusions where Vautrin, he's then disguised as a Spanish priest, by the way, Carlos Herrera, comes upon Lucien, who's about to drown himself, and picks him up and makes him his creature. And it really is the model for the moment where the Baron de Chalus in Search of Lost Time tries to cruise the narrator, Marcel. There's a great deal of Balzac and Proust.
Terrific. Someone asks, can you imagine how would Balzac's characters fare from a 21st century perspective with relation to identity, or the identity self-crisis is the phrase here?
Wow. That's a tough one. I mean, I think in a way that identity self-crisis already existed in the world that Balzac is talking about, in that, you know, this is part of his conservative nostalgia. He claims that in the old regime before the French Revolution, everyone had his place, his or her place in society. In fact, just by looking at people's clothes, you could tell what class they were from, what they did. And now in the 19th century, all men wear black and they all carry top hats. That's of course not true of the proletariat, of the workers, but he's more interested in the middle and upper classes. So a big question for him becomes, how do you know people's identity? How do you know if you can trust them? It may turn out that the businessman who lives next door to you in the hotel is really an ex-con in disguise. So I think there's a kind of, even though it seems like a more static society, there's the same fluidity in questions of identity that we now know.
That's great. Someone asked, is there a visual artist of the same period who appears to be Balzac's counterpart, who might be considered to be Balzac's counterpart?
That's an interesting question. I mean, it's not on the whole a great period for art, with the exception of Delacroix. And Balzac loved Delacroix's paintings and dedicated one of his tales to him. And Edwin had the good sense to put a detail of a Delacroix painting on the cover of the short story anthology we did. So there is Delacroix. I think, though, his subjects are very different from Balzac's. He's not really interested in bourgeois Paris. There's something about the melodrama and the coloring of Delacroix's paintings that does correspond to Balzac.
I would just throw in there briefly that he's almost a sort of merger of Ingres and Delacroix, in that the substantiality and frankly the sensuality of Ingres, the odalisques and so on is so, you know, in a way he's large and he contains multitudes, but those two I think are a bit there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think of Ingres a little bit later, but you're right. Yes.
Another attendee mentions Daumier as a visual counterpart.
Yeah, and that brings, I mean, that goes back to the comparison with Dickens. I don't think Balzac is quite as caricatural as Dickens, but there are certainly caricatures in him, which reminds you of Daumier.
Terrific. So someone mentions that they're really enjoying this program, which I think speaks for many of us, and says, speaking for themselves, when I read Cousin Bet, pardon my pronunciation, and Père Goriot, I felt horribly depressed in spite of admiring each book very much. Is the pleasure of reading Balzac the pleasure of seeing reality, no matter how awful it is? Can you comment on what it is in Balzac that creates readerly enjoyment? Thanks.
Well, I kind of agree that Cousine Bet is a bit depressing. I mean, the main protagonists there are this awful cousin of the family, Elizabeth Fischer, who was out for revenge against her sister-in-law and everyone in the family, and then her ally, Valérie Marneffe, who is this sexy and totally immoral creature. And together they managed to destroy just about everyone, more or less just for the fun of it. Though Madame Marneffe is punished by having some exotic disease that she gets from her Brazilian lover. It had to come from Latin America, of course. But the fun even of Cousine Bet is just to see how wildly these characters can enact their evil. I think the other novels, such as Père Goriot, are enormously pleasurable, partly because Eugène de Rastignac, even though he's full of ambition and full of moral compromises, is totally charming and very intelligent. I mean, it's partly about his education, right? And by the end, after he's buried old Goriot and he stands at the top of the Paris cemetery of Père Lachaise, and he looks down at Paris, he's able to see it as a kind of readable map in front of him of where he's got to go in order to conquer what he wants to conquer. And it's he's sort of come up to the same intelligence level as his creator. It's very exciting stuff.
Just a general note, I'm going to put in the chat once more our links to purchase Balzac's Lives. to share your thoughts on this event, to join the library if you are interested in doing so. Information like that in the chat. So I think we'll kind of move toward a close. We have a couple more questions, if that's good. If anyone else has a question they'd really like to throw in, do add it to the chat at this point. An attendee asks, how has Balzac been served by his English translators?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, one of the reasons that Balzac isn't as popular in the English-speaking world as he ought to be, I mean, he continues to be a bestseller in France, is because there are not enough modern translations. There was the whole of the Human Comedy was translated a couple of times around 1900, and every sort of cultured American family owned a complete set of the Human Comedy in English. That's disappeared, and there are few. I mean, Modern Library has a very good translation of Lost Illusions by Kathleen Rain. New York Review of Books has this terrific Memoirs of Two Young Wives, and I believe that Edwin has another one coming, or two. But a lot of the translations are sort of old and dusty, and not as much fun as they could be. So that's a problem.
Yeah, that's too bad. Well, we hope that new ones will continue to come out. And a patron mentions that the Society Library has the two older sets of translations, which is true, though. I think we also acquire newer ones as we can. So I'm going to throw in one question that I'm interested in that I think will also be of interest to others. So prior to our organizing this event, I happened to read an article in the Guardian newspaper, an interview with Mr. Frank, who said one of my favorite quotes about literature from recent years. He was asked, must a book be relevant? And replied, I'm extremely suspicious of the notion. It seems to me simply to feed people back to themselves. The best art is often powerfully irrelevant. I prefer the idea of currency, which is not quite the same as relevance. A book that has currency puts our present concerns in a different but distinct perspective. So I hope that's not embarrassing to quote you back at yourself, Mr. Frank, but I thought it was a great line. Does that reflect on Balzac or 19th century literature as we read it now? Currency but not relevance, or relevance in a different way than we think of it when we say the word now?
I think very much so with Balzac. I mean, I think Balzac, Peter says at the end of his book that Balzac is the indispensable writer for the understanding of the modern world, which, you know, raises up the ante on Oscar Wilde saying Balzac created the 19th century, but in a way there's a continuity. The 19th century created us, and by looking some things we think, well, our own strangeness becomes clear by looking at ourselves in the 19th century mirror sometimes.
That's good. I mean, Balzac is really present at the creation of the modern world. He's the first to see it. That's
wonderful. So anything else anyone would like to add that hasn't been added to the present time? And I think we'll say thank you so much, Professor Brooks, Mr. Frank, audience. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Thank you.
And next time.
Thank you. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.